Five? Do I just go? All right. All right. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those that are joining us virtually from across the country. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are fortunate to be able to join you from the traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. We recognize and respect the First Nation governments across the region, the province, and Canada. Before I get into today, I also want to just make note, particularly for those people that are joining us virtually, that we've got a slight program change and we're going to carry on with the awards ceremony right after. So that should be short. It's probably between 5 and 10 minutes. For those here, that means we'll go lunch, and lunch will just extend right till 1 when we originally were going to have you come back. So hopefully the people participating virtually will be able to join us for that ceremony as well. Secondly, I'd also like to thank FCM and the Government of Canada who made today's panel session available virtually across the country through funding through the Municipal Asset Management Program. So Asset Management BC is excited to have 4 Canadian asset management pioneers participating in this session today. Guy Filio, Conrad Sue, Reg Andres, and Wally Wells will share their perspectives on how asset management has evolved in Canada and the significant actions and initiatives that have shaped asset management in Canada. A little bit about our panel, and I hope you guys appreciate I've ad-libbed your bios a little bit, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, Guy obtained his PhD from civil engineering from Texas A&M University after undergraduate and graduate studies in Ottawa and a few years of consulting work. He started his career as a university professor at UCLA and returned to Canada in the early 90s, spending 2 years as a consultant, then joined the National Research Council to become the head of the Urban Infrastructure Rehabilitation Research Group. The research conducted by the group focused on finding practical solutions to municipal infrastructure challenges, including the management of their assets. It is during that time that he developed the concept and built awareness and engagement to create the National Guide to Sustainable Municipal Infrastructure, known as InfraGuide. Conrad Sue. Conrad established the Office of Infrastructure for the City of Edmonton in 2000. The office developed and implemented strategies, tools, and processes to address the increasing infrastructure renewal and growth needs in Edmonton. For the past 2 decades, he has participated in several national asset management initiatives in Canada and has been invited to speak in numerous conferences and seminars. He has retired from the city about 6 years ago and has been teaching part-time at the University of British Columbia. Reg Andres. Reg Andres is an infrastructure management specialist with over 49 years of experience as a municipal civil engineer. He has specialized in asset management for municipal infrastructure systems planning, developing and implementing sustainability and life cycle assessment projects and programs. His work has included presenting asset management and life cycle costing principles to the Walkerton Inquiry, chairing of the expert panel for the Core Infrastructure Systems Technology Roadmap, co-founding of the National Roundtable for Sustainable Infrastructure and the National Asset Management Working Group, as well as chairing the Project Steering Committee for the Canadian Infrastructure Report Cards, and that's just to name a few. And Wally Wells. Everyone knows Wally. Do I need to do that? But I will anyway. So Wally Wells is a registered professional engineer with 52 years of experience. He has worked for local governments, the provincial agencies, and the private sector, including 31 years with Dillon Consulting. In 2004, he became the first executive director for Ontario Public Works Association. Upon relocation to Nanaimo, BC in 2006, he became the first executive director of the newly formed group of what is now known as Asset Management BC. Asset management was part of his career at Dillon Consulting, where he developed the company's practice area and expertise. He was a director and president of the Canadian Public Works Association and was involved in many of the activities you'll hear about today, including InfraGuide, Civil Infrastructure Systems, the Technology Roadmap, the National Asset Management Working Group, and our committees of practice across Canada, including Asset Management BC. So welcome, panelists, and for me, it is a great honor and a privilege to be here moderating your session. But of course, moderating your session is going to be a bit of a challenge. These four individuals do like to tell stories, and I'll be trying my best to keep them on task and on time. So my job is a tough one. Please wish me luck. Okay. So let's begin. So the first era, pre-2000s. So while we've been managing assets since assets were created, it is in the pre-2000 era where, by flipping the order of the two words to asset management, it began to evolve as something different. And if we think back of the 80s and the 90s, as some of us who are nostalgic like to, and some of, I guess, who were around, perhaps some of us weren't all around then, but you know, I can remember things like the death of disco, big hair, an Edmonton Oilers dynasty in hockey, E.T. the Extraterrestrial in the 80s and the Titanic in the 90s were the top grossing movies. And the census recorded the population of Canada as under 22 million in 1981. More importantly to asset management, in 1987, the Brundtland Commission brought us the first definition of sustainability, an important piece, which was later broadened in the 90s to include social economics. Nationally, we saw environment rising to the top of the political agenda in the 80s and the 90s. And in the 90s, debt elimination became a national focus, resulting in downloading and coining the phrase, doing more with less. At the local level, in the 70s and 80s, environmental and growth-related infrastructure began to boom. However, it became clear that historical infrastructure deterioration and debt reduction were on a collision course. Now to the panel, I asked the following two questions. What was your perspective on what was happening with infrastructure management pre-2000? And what was your introduction to asset management in its infancy during this period? Now, you can answer one or both or none. Well, maybe not none. Anyway, I'm going to start with Guy.
Thanks, Glenn. And yeah, disco. Come on, Glenn. Thinking about the pre-90s, and I would go pre-80s, and I would go, before that, because when we were doing pavement management, we were not calling it what we're calling it today, but basically the principles were the same. And going back, and I think that everybody knows that we're dating ourselves from being on this panel, that really pavement management came about from the work that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did for the U.S. Air Force. And so back in the late 70s, already we were doing, and I was doing pavement management with some of the work that the late Ralph Haas was doing, a pioneer in pavement management, wrote a number of books on it and so on. So for me, when I'm thinking about that era, I'm thinking about inventory, condition, valuation, and needs assessment for pavements. And we're so happy, and you see on the slide, this is Micro Paver 5.1. Because when I started doing pavement management back then, it was putting the data on a tape. We took the tape and we sent it to a university someplace in the US. They would run it, send us back the results, and if we made a mistake, then we had to start all over again. Micropaver came with the vanilla PC from IBM. You may remember that, the real floppy disks that we used to have. Yeah. And I was so happy to be able to run this thing on our desk. And so that, for me, was the introduction to asset management, but specifically for roads. And when I joined back the National Research Council, and at the time, back in 1992, the federal government did not use municipal in any title. But we were working for municipalities. And started the program, and we called it the Urban Infrastructure Rehabilitation Research. And that became actually the largest single research program that dealt with municipal type research. Now, I'm looking at Conrad because one of the first projects that we did was in the city of Edmonton, and we were looking at what was causing all the cracking in the sidewalks of the city of Edmonton, costing them, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in terms of repairs. So imagine, we are sitting at the National Research Council, the grand research institution of Canada, and we have a group that is really walking sidewalks in Edmonton to find out what's happening, while everybody else is doing nanotechnology work, aerospace work, and so on. So my challenge really at the time was to convince our researchers, top researchers in Canada, that it was worth looking at sidewalk cracking in the city of Edmonton. Now, that worked out because actually the city of Quebec took on the same program that we developed for Edmonton, and they were, that became sidewalk asset management. And at the same time, there was this idea that we needed more than just, a few researchers. We needed to create these centers of expertise. And that's when the CERU was created back in 1994, and CAT, the Center for the Advancement of Trenchless Technologies, was created as well. Now, my researchers were not happy because, paying for those two contributions came out of their research budget, but that's another story for another time. Thank you.
So Guy, you were in the research world. I lived in the
You were the receiving end.
I was in the real world. I was consulting. I was designing. I was building. And I can tell you the word asset management did not exist in my vocabulary in the 70s, in the 80s. I was introduced in asset management in the 90s, but the 70s and 80s was all about environment and environmental assessment. Glenn mentioned that in terms of what was going on in the industry. The consulting world, and I think a lot of the municipal world, and therefore who I responded to, we didn't have that language. I was introduced to it, however, I saw the stuff that researchers are doing, and it just, okay, very nice, see ya, I gotta go design this. The mid-90s, I got a project from the city of Hamilton, and anybody that knows Hamilton probably knows Leo Goyer, a visionary in asset management. Without a doubt, I learned my core from him. Anyways, the project was a 5-year asset management project. Reg, I need to know what we have and what it's worth, and move on to how to manage this. And so that's how I got my introduction to it. And as a typical engineer, bottom-up approach. We spent, it was like a 5-year program, collecting data, analyzing condition, figuring that all out. It was a long, slow process until right in the middle of the assignment, Leo said, Reg, time out, no, I need answers now. He said, this feels to me like I've got a couple airplanes in the air and they're going to drop out of the sky at some point, i.e. I'm going to get a major incident of failure in my system that I cannot afford. So we turned the whole thing upside down. Instead of bottom up, we took a top-down consideration, and that's absolutely, for me, the beginning and an aha moment when we didn't craft it. I think it was kind of out there a little bit. The 6 questions of asset management, very simple. What have you got? What is it worth? What condition is it in? What do you need to do to it? When do you need to do it? And how much? So that, to me, was the introduction. And that was right at the end of that era. Before that, AM didn't kind of exist for me, interestingly.
Yeah, but you were also involved in a number of activities when we were thinking about, this infrastructure gap,
yeah.
Okay, and the deficit, and again, I don't want to take out of the thunder from Conrad, but we were talking about this, and the numbers were growing, and we're thinking it was $57 billion and $123 billion, and so on. And basically, I kept on saying, look, my calculator doesn't have enough zeros to count for all that deficit number, and I will never have that kind of money in my bank. So who cares? And then Conrad came out with a particular quote that caught on.
Yeah.
Okay, so. Thank you. I also say that I also live in the real world, even more practical, like many of you working for municipalities. So I'm going to use Edmonton as an example to start telling the story of how asset management started in Edmonton. I use Edmonton though, but actually it's also similar for Canadian municipalities. Oh, doesn't worked a while. Oh, here you go. So I'd like to start with showing this graph, which is a proxy for growth in Edmonton. So it's a 100-year graph, right? Starting at the turn of the last century, 1900. And the y-axis is the kilometer of sewer constructed, which is a proxy of growth. So if you look at the graph, Edmonton has experienced quite a few periods of growth. First World War, Second World War, and oil boom in the 70s, even though it's oil boom in Alberta. But during that time, Canada also experienced growth across. Then, of course, came the 90s. How many of you remember that you paid 19% mortgage rate? Oh, some of you do, okay. 19%, so what's the big deal about today's mortgage rate? So it was really tough, right? It was really tough. And during that period of time, because of high interest rate policy, Canada and the rest of the world got into a great recession. And when you borrow with such a high interest rate, the municipalities started to cut back on the budget, reduce borrowing, and also when you cut the budget, where do you cut the most? Preventive maintenance is easy to cut, that you don't see the result right away, the outcome right away, so it's easy target to cut. And then we also, because of the high interest rate, we also started to pay down the debt. So yes, we are paying down the debt, but we are building up a different type of debt, and that is the infrastructure debt. Also in the 90s, now municipality, and you all appreciate that, most of you work for the municipality, appreciate that our primary sources of revenues are property taxes and user fees. And we rely considerably on provincial government for grants to build, especially capital projects. But 90s, there was also cutback from the provincial government. So during the 80s and the 90s, there was tremendous reduction in terms of budget, capital budget or operating budget and renewal budget. And there's a tremendous reduction in the way we manage and maintain and renew our infrastructure. Close to the turn of the century, around 1998, the city of Edmonton started doing a long-range financial plan. And it identified that there would be a significant gap ahead of us, an infrastructure gap. There's a difference between our needs and the resources available to actually meet the needs to maintain our infrastructure to a good stage of repair. When it was presented to council, it wasn't received with favoritisms. And look at it, say, the gap is too big. You guys are trying to scare us, right? And so because of that, my administration recognized that we need to really define our needs much better. And the Office of Infrastructure was created in 2000. I just remember February 2000. I was appointed to develop the office with the mandate of defining our needs and also developing solutions to address the infrastructure gap. And so our office continued to start developing strategies, tools, and processes, and start embarking on the asset management journey. But I should also mention, though, we do have very good mentors at that time. Guy is one of them, right? You came to us in 1999 to talk about that. But we also have good help and direction and mentorship, mentored by Dr. Ralph Haas. I don't remember the late Dr. Ralph Haas from the University of Waterloo. And also Dr. Saeed Miraz from McGill University. So those are really the pioneers guiding us along. So we can look at only the second generation, not the first generation. Okay, so essentially that's how we started in asset management.
The only thing I'll add to this at this point, in benefit of time, is I was on the board of the Canadian Public Works Association, and Reg was very involved with Canadian Society for Civil Engineering at the time. We had a lot of interface at that point as well. We also, through the conferences internationally, we got quite involved and quite knowledgeable in the Institute of Public Works Engineering in Australia, who produced one of the first manuals out there, and a lot of back and forth with that. And in fact, I subsequently had an awful lot of discussion with the Australians, and they have pleaded guilty, and I'll tell you what they pleaded guilty to. A lot of people said to us, what is asset management? And my answer to them is, how many decades have you been managing assets? Because you have them, and All we did, unfortunately, was take managing assets and flip the words around asset management and confuse the entire world. And the Australians said, yeah, we plead guilty, we did it. But that's important because it will come back into the discussion later on, including some of the activities through Asset Management BC. But that interface with IPWA has been very, very critical, very knowledgeable, and we still today have that interface. And that was sort of my experience back through the 90s, as well as living all of the experience that you've heard here to the table. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, panelists.
Do you want to flip it to the next era?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
sorry.
I'm sorry, I missed a couple click. I was going to talk about, by that time, at the turn of the century, sorry, can you go back? By the turn of the century, the infrastructure, can you go back?
No, I can't.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. So I forgot to mention about that, why all of a sudden there was an awakening at the turn of the century. If you look at this graph, the infrastructure by that time, the ones constructed in the 70s is already 50, in the Second World War is 50 years old. And those constructed in the 70s is already 30 years old. The average age of infrastructure in Edmonton is about 50. Yeah, the pipe can last to 70, 80 years, right? The road, 30 years. The buses is only about 15 years. So on average, it's 50 years old. So by the time some of the infrastructure is already 50 years, some of the infrastructure have already passed the useful life. And some is getting close to the end of the useful life. I think that was the reason why all of a sudden a number of municipalities and also the residents are realizing that our infrastructure is deteriorating. Sorry to go back.
No, that's fine. And
No, I'm going to have to move on because I was about to pat myself on the shoulder to say I'm keeping these guys on time. But if it's all right, I'm going to move to the next era, Reg.
that's where I wanted to go.
Okay. All right, just a show of hands. Who was born before 2000, or who was born after 2000 in this room? All right, so now I understand the age of the group. Anyway.
What about 1950?
Yeah. I'm not going there. Anyway, 2000 to 2010, the next area we're going to talk about is the creation of the asset management industry. So just a little bit about, let's go back to partying like it's 1999. The next era for the panelists almost never happened because everyone remember Y2K? We weren't going to get through it, but we did gratefully. Apparently velvet tracksuits were a fad. I know I didn't own one. iPods were introduced. And AOL Instant Messenger was the glimpse into the future of social media. This decade also brought us some global unrest, the September 11th terrorist attacks and the war on terror. It brought us, in 2007, it brought us the global recession. Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast, right? So one of the real first big major hurricane disasters. From an asset management perspective, it was a period of significant growth and the creation of an asset management industry in Canada. Globally, climate change and the human impact on Earth were accepted as truths by most. Infrastructure became a national issue with the creation of Infrastructure Canada and the National Asset Management Working Group, the National Roundtable for Sustainable Infrastructure. At a local level, in part spurred by Walkerton, the principles of asset management started to be integrated into regulated industry. So the question for the panel is, this was a significant period of advancement for asset management. From your perspective, what was or were the most influential activities or events that advanced the AM industry in this 10-year period? And I think I'll go to Reg, since I cut you off before.
Yeah, that's okay. You're right. This was the significant period. In the rear view mirror, it's most interesting to see the evolution of asset management and where it has gone today and how it got there. But I can tell you, we were neophytes. We were just trying to make these steps. I had my aha moment, and I wrote it in a book called Ahead of the Wave. FCM published that document, and I thank them for that. It's probably asset management for dummies or that version. It's very simplistic about what it is we're trying to do. There's no black magic about it. It's just managing assets, figuring out when to spend money on these things. At the same time, and this is just circumstance, who knows what happens in the world, Walkerton hit, probably the most devastating incident in Ontario's water history and Canada's water history. People died because of contamination. And so there was then a major inquiry, a commission that was called to figure out how to do this better. I had the good fortune of being able to present to the commission about asset management and full life cycle accounting, a financial perspective, if you will, about it. I wouldn't have ever done that if I hadn't written the book Ahead of the Wave. Never. I would have not felt qualified. But the simple message came to Walkerton, and it actually resulted in one of the many, many recommendations about financial management on a life cycle basis that the commission actually put forward. So I just mentioned those very quickly, like who knows what happens, and it's only in retrospect when you see these things. I just want to have a quick focus on the technology roadmap. We were starting to figure out, okay, we've got to understand where is it? Like, what are the main key objectives of managing our infrastructure? And so a number of parties got together. Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, what is now Engineers Canada, it was CCPE, the Canadian Council of Professional Engineers. Canadian Public Works Association happened to be headed by Mr. Wells or represented by him. The National Research Council, which happened to be the guy to my right, Guy Filio. And we came together and said, let us do this roadmap to see where we're kind of going, try to lay a plan out. And I didn't realize until coming back and looking at this how important that particular document was and is. And in fact, I think to the point that I see Wally actually carrying it under his arm. He walks around with it all the time to remind him about what we're trying to do here and so on. That was a very important documentation. I had the privilege of chairing the expert panel that reviewed the information that came from a series of town hall meetings facilitated by Guy and authored and later by the CAT group and with Queen's University, Mark Knight, Ian Moore, if those names mean anything to you folks. And we got a national consensus on 10 objectives with 10 recommendations. And we had a 10-year perspective on it. The creation of the roundtable, the creation and the importance of a network of experts, of centers of excellence, were recommendations out of that book. So you can see it began to lead us of where we ought to go. So I'll leave it there and let the guys talk about some of those things that followed out. I think, again, in the research world, like you had this idea of this infra guide gig. It was,
yeah, and you know, you keep on insisting about my research, but I was a practical researcher as opposed to theoretical researcher. So what we were doing was really finding solutions, and in response to some of the needs from the consulting industry, and I want to make a link as well to what Wally was saying about Australia, IPWA, and the importance of those linkages. And I want to make sure that the people remember in this room and whoever is watching us around the cyberspace that Australia and Canada and New Zealand basically started about the same time producing and thinking about asset management. Now, parenthesis is that they were way better than we did in Canada in terms of promoting what they were doing as opposed to we did it internally. And so, the other thing is that, look, Australians and New Zealanders, they love to come to BC because they can go and ski in the Rockies, and that's a perfect location for them. But I'm saying this because in Australia, it really started around 2000 with Dr. Penny Burns. And she's the one, really, in my book, that coined asset management as the terminology that we're using today. But at the same time that they were doing this, down under, we were looking at how are we going to define best practices that are going to help the consultants that need help, the municipalities that need help, the associations that need help. And this is where the concept of infra guide came about. Defined at around 1997, 1998. The National Research Council was convinced that this was a good thing, so they funded a group of, including myself, to go and promote this and gauge the pulse of municipalities and consultants. Is this a valuable tool? And the result was, yes, it is. And back in 2001, then the National Research Council, FCM, got funding from Infrastructure Canada, the Treasury Board of Canada, and then developed this program, which, by the way, you can still have access to all those best practices. So if you need them, Reg, I can give you the URL. And of course, we got the legacy pin that's basically in all the mementos and so on that I found in my basement. I found 5 pins, so sorry I don't have any for everybody. But that was really 55 best practices. And I remember discussions around this about how were we going to be writing this. And our friend Wally here says, we're going to focus on the why, because we need to tell people why they're doing this. We're going to focus on the what do you need to do, but we're not going to focus on the how, because the how is linked to technology, and technology is going to change, and therefore if you include the how there, then you have a limited shelf time for that best practice. We did that, and those 55 best practices are still being used today. And again, by working on these solutions, that led me to start looking at what was happening back from the climate change perspective. 2005 with Engineers Canada, the PIVC protocol, and this is a huge topic, that asset management now is looking at the linkages with climate change. There was another moment in that period that was critical to asset management. And the infra guy died. It was not a nice death, but it died with 350 volunteers that were left hanging there because there were people working this. So my saying is, where engineers failed, which was infra guide, then the accountants, including with the help of one engineer with public sector accounting board, started working on something that was, again, a milestone.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, it was quite interesting. Andy, you're an accountant, right? And I know you.
Not admitting.
But you remember those days, 2007, PSAP 3150, and then by January the 1st, 2007. Yeah. And by 2009, local governments have to report on the cost, report on the tangible capital assets, including the cost and the amortization is financial, but at the same time, you need to consider the condition, the expected life, and remaining life of the infrastructure. Right? And all this was spelled out in addition to Section 3150, they have a SOR, the Statement of Recommended Practice, and that's what he was referring to. So I was the only engineer in the task force with 9 accountants. It was quite an interesting experience, but I think it's a really worthwhile experience. It really underscored the importance of these 2 different disciplines work together for the sake of advancing infrastructure assets management. So this is a really important step, important milestone in the assets management history. And I also like to comment on some of the things on top, on your slide, on the right-hand side. Infrastructure Canada was created in 2002. Before that, it existed as some kind of a branch and a treasury branch and so on. But then also at the same time, they started introducing some funding program. And infrastructure was created to support and provide funding for Canadian infrastructure. Now, 2004 is a very interesting year for me as well. There was a federal election, 2004. There was also a provincial election in Alberta, as well as a municipal election. In all 3 elections, infrastructure has emerged to be an election platform. That's really demonstrates that the politicians or decision makers, they understood the importance and the pressing needs of infrastructure. And that also created an elevated level of awareness of the importance of asset management. And for subsequent years, there's a lot more federal programs and provincial funding programs that came along to help municipality, local government.
And in that time, Conrad, like I thought, okay, we had reached the pinnacle, we had arrived at asset management, when history shows clearly not. But again, we didn't have the history. We don't know what happened next. This was happening, and we thought we have arrived because the federal government was providing funding programs. Asset management was on top of the political agenda in many respects, just like environment has and probably still was at the time.
But I think what was key to what you said, Conrad, about PSAB and engineering and so on, is that, the fact that, throughout the years, and I'm going to let, Wally talk about that, that we really realized as an industry that this was a multidiscipline activity. It was not engineers. Engineers are necessary but not sufficient. Planners are necessary but not sufficient. Accountants and so on. So we really started building this industry from a multidiscipline perspective. And I think that this is different than what other countries have done. But Wally, you were there, so you can tell us.
What you're going to see here, we're building up also because we owe you to the understanding of how Asset Management BC came about and where we're at. And this is sort of some of the background. We'll get there. But it's very important. Initially, the federal government sort of said, local government's not our responsibility. And it wasn't. And it was through lobbying from Federation of Canadian Municipalities that with a lot of reluctance, the federal government said, okay, we'll fund infrastructure once. Well, thank heavens they kept at it. And initially, the funding was through Treasury Board, and ultimately, Treasury Board said, this is not our role. Infrastructure Canada was created. Later on, the legislation was modified and so forth to allow it to be a full ministry with a minister. We did mention InfraGuide. I had the pleasure of being on the governing council of that, and he mentioned 350 volunteers. The way InfraGuide was done was to set up committees for all 55 practices, and those committees involved practitioners from across Canada. Some of you may have been involved in those committees. InfraGuide also hired a person in each province, and it was Neil Nyberg in BC, who is still the executive director of MMCD. So that gave us an in as to a person that was really pushing the infrastructure window locally and paid to set up workshops and really promote where we were going with it. When this report on the technology roadmap was done, there was a lot of things done, but one of the keys, in my opinion, as to one of the most fundamental game changers of infrastructure in Canada, you're looking at basically one person that isn't here with us, Marie LeMay, who was then the president of Engineers Canada. I don't think Conrad was at that particular meeting, but heavily involved in this report. We took this report into Infrastructure Canada, and Andre Junot was the deputy minister at that time, and he called the assistant deputy ministers together. And we went in and we said, thank you for the meeting, and they had all the top officials of Infrastructure Canada here, and we had a key question, and the answer really was the game changer. We said, as basically technical knowledgeable people, to the deputy minister, thank you for writing the checks for millions and millions of dollars that you're doing. We're absolutely delighted, and we hope we keep it up. But our question for you is, do you at Infrastructure Canada just want to be a check-writing agency, or do you want to be a player in the game of infrastructure, asset management, and the core across Canada? And Andre folded his arms and sat back and he said, I think we want to be a player. That was probably one of the most important decisions in Canada for all of us, because had they just be a check writer, we would be in a different circumstance today. And that led to all of us saying, thank you. We are here and we will stay here as long as you want us. And 20 years later, we are still there. There was, and I think one of the things that came out, Conrad mentioned Edmonton, we were talking about it this morning. One of the things we were saying to Infrastructure Canada, they said everybody's got dire needs and we'll do it. And they mentioned one day Edmonton, they did this really great report and they're not in trouble. We said, excuse me, and this was collectively from all of us through our associations, what Edmonton have done with their asset management program and strategy is show you they are in trouble. not badly, but they will be if they don't. They have the actual data, proof of the $500 million that they needed for infrastructure. And that was an enlightenment to the staff at Infrastructure Canada, because we said, please stop funding bad behavior. And that was rather critical, and they picked up on that remark. And you'll see an awful lot today, criteria in your grant programs and so forth, that's moving ahead a little. But this is where some of that original thinking came from. From this report, we had the roundtable. Glenn was involved as chair of the small committees. That didn't go as far as we want, but one committee that came out of that was the National Infrastructure Committee, which was co-chaired with Canada, with CPWA, Canadian Public Works Association, and Infrastructure Canada paid for that. Out of that came a national framework, which actually Reg was the primary author of that, which today still stands valid on there, and we had, and this will lead to where we go with things. Guy mentioned the why and the what. We asked over the 3 years we met 3 questions. What is asset management? Why do asset management? And how to do asset management? As Guy said, 2 of those questions we answered. After much discussion, we chose not to answer the how. And if just even think here in BC, but think even broader across the country. The legislation for our local governments in our territories and our provinces is provincial or territorial. They're governed, the First Nations are governed mostly through agreements, treaties, and a whole bunch of other things through the federal government mostly. Some are now equivalent to local governments. The sizes, the populations, the physiography, you can name 1,000 differences in our communities, culture, and everything else. One size does not fit all. And that was very, very much of where we went. I'll just finish at this point with Guy also saying one of the things that we learned from that national committee, which was about, I think, 20 people or so on it, it was very diverse with politicians, finance, planners, engineers, operations people. And a key lesson we learned, which Glenn and I brought back to carry to Asset Management BC, is it's not about one of us. And from day one, when we get to the AMBC story, that has been a driver for us right there. It's about all of us, and whatever it is we do, how we do it, we're all engaged. It goes across the organization, not in the way we work. And I'll stop there.
No, Wally, you're not quite finished. You got to tell the donut shop story. Because it was critical.
We,
It was a Starbucks, sorry. You know, it wasn't
It was
a donut
Starbucks.
shop. What was
Well, they sell donuts.
The 4 of us walked in with this report and said to Infrastructure Canada, what are you going to do? And again, Mr. Junot stepped back and sort of crossed his arms and said, yeah, you know, we can do this, we can do this. And he looked at a couple of the recommendations and said, these really aren't us, these are you. What are you guys going to do? Well, we were not ready for that comment. So he looked at us, put the book on the table, and said, I'm adjourning this meeting. Be back here in 2 weeks. I will have the same people in the room. Have your act together. So what Reg is referring to was probably, again, a very key meeting that took place at an outside patio on Starbucks on Sparks Street with the table for 4, which was a national meeting at that time of Asset Management Canada. And we crafted the plan to answer those questions of what our groups and our associations were going to do. And we went back, and with that plan in place and with the commitments from Infrastructure Canada, it helped us move forward to where we are continuing today.
And that story reinforces the fact that, did we know where we were going? We sort of had this vision.
Yeah.
But what are the small steps that you take? And then until we get challenged by, you know, senior people at the federal government, like, what are you going to do? That was mind-numbing in many respects, and it awakened us up. So,
But the commitment from, and you talked about André Junot, the deputy minister, and the commitment for doing things, and you know, his commitment to doing things was the fact that he funded the National Asset Management Working Group.
Yes, he did.
You know, with Tony Variano being their representative from Infrastructure
Yeah.
Canada,
Yeah.
and then created this that, expecting that the industry, all the players in the industry were going to contribute. And look, we're really terrible at finding acronyms. We have NAMWAG, we have NERC, we have PIVC, we have, we're not good at that. But the meaning of that was that from our perspective, the National Asset Management Working Group, which created that framework, that created a number of other documents, because you were talking about PSAP 3150. Well, CSCE did a study on, how to link PSAP 3150 with asset management. And there was a survey done of CEO. And really between the National Asset Management Working Group, the National Roundtable, and so on, emerged the need to have these communities of practice. And this is when Mr. Wells here decided to leave Ontario and move to Nanaimo, and then what'd you do? You started working on the rest of the story.
Over to you, Wally.
Next decade.
Yeah, in 2006, I relocated, and I had been in touch with Glenn, of course, because of the Small Communities Committee. And I phoned Glenn and said, okay, I'm here. I was retired, and said, what are we going to do about this? And the gentleman to my right had the vision to really start the creation of Asset Management BC. Well, he was working for the province at that time and had a full-time job, so I'm retired. And he said, we don't have any money. And I said, I don't care. I have a passion for asset management. We'll just do it. And the direction I got from Glenn is, yeah, do it. Whatever, just do it. Don't ask, just do it. If we need to ask forgiveness, I'm really good at doing that. Just do it. And that is where we really kicked off with the community of practice, as it's now called. There were a few other similar groups in Canada. We have been, and we'll maybe come back to that a little later, we have been very engaged and involved right across Canada with the whole story, and we do an awful lot of sharing of information. One of the things we did, and I'll just mention it now, I'll come back to others later, and I mentioned the Australians earlier. Early on, you were asking us, because asset management isn't me or Glenn or the province, it's you. We are there for you. If you didn't need the resources and the help that we do, we wouldn't be here. You tell us what you need, and we try and get it for you. And that's really important. And as I said, the lesson we learned is it had to be multidisciplinary. And that has been where we have been, is to keep and engage all of the disciplines in there. We were looking for training because you wanted training. We didn't want proprietary training. We went back to Australia and found an AMBC program. With help and really the direction from Glenn, the province funded the first NAMS training in Canada, which was held in Golden, BC, when David Allen was the CAO there before his move later on to Courtenay. And David said, me, we'll do it. And Glenn said, yes, we'll do it. So we held the first session with our two Australia trainers in Golden in British Columbia. And that was where we went from there. And then AMBC, fortunately, through a number of multiple arrangements, was able to offer that. So that is why I wanted to link earlier the IPWA in Australia with what's here. A lot of you have trained, I think, David Golden or Courtenay itself, your direction as a CAO, you put 30-some people over about 5 workshops through that, so that people, even if they weren't doing asset management or engaged in asset management, every department in some form is engaged in it, and he wanted his staff at Courtenay to really understand what asset management was about and not silo it. I got accused of our very first chair of asset management, BC, who was left the province, so he wasn't here that long, but he said to me one day, Wally, I'm really tired of you talking about the silos. Stop it. And I looked at him as a CAO and said, you know, when you get your organization and your local government out of the silos, I'll stop talking about it. That was the end of the conversation, because it is a bit of an issue we have, as you know, a lot of vertical working when we're trying to deal with a horizontal thing and the cultural issues. We've had a lot of background and experience in that and a lot of newsletter articles. So Glenn, back to you.
Well,
All right.
just before you do that, are we timed out or
I'm going to let you guys come back to this train of
30
talk.
seconds?
Go.
There's one group that we should mention, and that was the Canadian Network of Asset Management, CNAM.
CNAM, yes.
It was one of those, it's a national organization, and similar to the local networks, the CNAM has created a big role, an important role, in that communication across the country and pushing that. And while they said it was by municipalities, for municipalities, they ultimately let a couple of consultants in sometimes to be on their board, so good for them.
Yeah, I also want to mention that just 5 seconds. Started in May in 2007, Hamilton, and then was established 2019. The 7 communities, the municipalities are Montreal, Halifax, Ottawa, Hamilton, Calgary, Edmonton, and Burnaby.
Okay?
All right. Thanks for that, panel.
No, go
No.
ahead. Go ahead. I'll come back
Otherwise,
to it.
I
I'll
won't
come
have a
back to
chance to
it.
talk. But I'm going to note 2007, a Hamilton slide that I've used numerous times, whether with the province or UBCM, broke down the costs per unit or cost per person for services such as drinking water, wastewater, and then coffee, milk, right? And I think the point was that they were trying to increase the cost or the fees for water by 10 cents a person or something like that. You know, backlash, major backlash, but the average person was paying, you know, at the time, $3 for a Starbucks coffee every day. So anyway, just put it all in perspective. All right, I'm going to move on because I'm falling behind as a moderator, but that's all right. 2010 to present. So this is really where asset management, I think, became institutionalized in Canada. You know, for us BCers and all of Canada, really, you know, it started with the Winter Olympics in Vancouver. You know, on the sports theme, the Toronto Raptors won the NBA championships. Chicago Cubs finally won the World Series. The Game of Thrones premiered in 2011. I don't watch it, but I know lots of people do. Kim Kardashian broke the internet, and Black Panther broke the box office. Social media and soundbite information changed how we communicate through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. This era also brought us President Donald Trump, as well as Brexit. But as asset management continues to evolve in Canada, it is slowly becoming institutionalized and becoming part of the culture. Globally, asset management has been linked more and more to sustainability and sustainable communities. Formal asset management tools have been developed and or enhanced internationally. I think the panelists has already talked about some of those. Nationally, infrastructure and infrastructure funding continue to hold political attention, but now supported by the principles of asset management. Locally, asset management principles are embraced, adopted, and implemented, but at various levels, sometimes through the stick and carrot of federal and provincial governments, others by local leaders and champions on the ground at the community level. So now to the panel. A question is, in the past decade, additional growth has taken place effectively institutionalizing asset management in Canada. What were some of the highlights from your perspective? And maybe, Wally, maybe if you want to kind of carry on with your train of thought where you left it.
Yeah, I'll focus on BC because when I was executive director up till July 1 this year, it was time for transition, and David very kindly, much my urging, has taken over. But I told him at the time, and I said, we do asset management because it's fun. And it is fun. And he called me a couple weeks ago and said, I'm really busy. I got this meeting. I can't talk too long. I've got this. We got the conference. I said, oh, by the way, I'm having fun. That's very important. When the grant programs came in, there was some linkage to asset management that were not well defined. And I said to Glenn one day, you're going to be getting phone calls at UBCM and Brian at the province. Okay, you're talking about you like to be doing asset management in order to have a better consideration for your grant. What are we going to tell them? And Glenn very quickly came up with the wheel, as it got known as Glenn's wheel, which has also now been translated by New Brunswick into French. And that is the framework for British Columbia, and that's really what you should be working to today. And there's 4 other primers out there, and possibly others in the works on that.
And please pick them up. They're in the front. I don't want to put them back in my truck.
That is your key document. We've had people like Kelowna, for instance, use the wheel to put another ring on it and show council what they've done, and they've done that about 3 times now, and where they're at and what they're going to do. That has been a very, very key document. We've mentioned training. David's talked in his opening remarks about the newsletter. That's something I personally am very, very proud of, and we developed that with 37 editions. I think actually it's 38 now, David, with about 3 a year, so you know how long that's been going on. And most of you do get it. Thanks to Brian, it is distributed through the province Civic Info and a long list. It goes to 5 countries, including Australia, the US, UK, and South Africa. And it's been, the comments we've had back in the survey Jan mentioned this morning have been very positive, but always you can improve things, and you've referenced some improvements. Case studies we've tried to put in everybody. Everybody loves case studies and loves stories because it says what the other guy did. And we try to make sure that we get that information for you. Those are some of the things that AMBC have done. You're hearing more about it. That framework document is very, very critical to where we're at. We just updated our mandate, basically, when people say, who is Asset Management BC, what do you do? We're here for you as local governments. We're here for our First Nations, and we have a lot of our First Nations here. Yes, thank you very much for being here. And thanks to Danny as well of Indigenous Affairs for helping bring them here. We've been doing more training because if the difference in First Nations and asset management physically is 0. The difference is the funding models. And that's more on the implementation side of where it's at. The fact whether you've got assets, you've got your inventories and so forth, that's common. That has nothing to do with who owns them. It has to do with physically what you need to do. So those things have all been coming together with the new website, the resources there, the change in resources, the training. We're doing level of service training, a lot of words around optimization of asset management now, moving away from just doing a plan, which is only one box on that wheel. So Asset Management BC, we think, has evolved. It will continue to evolve thanks to David and Glenn's leadership on that. Glenn formed a partnership committee about 4 or 5 years ago, Glenn, now. And what Glenn was able to do was convince a number of the associations, just an example, the province, UBCM, BCWWA, Public Works Association, the Planning Institute, Municipal Finance Authority, Municipal Insurance Association. I may have missed 1 or 2 in there. I think there's 9 now that they pay a little bit of money. That's not really the core. It's really that they believe that their asset management is important to their ventures. So do we. We very much partner and help each other in that. We had what we called the Asset Management Working Group. We've changed it to the name Community of Practice. And it's a term that Andy Wardell, our co-chair, really came out of the medical community. If you Google Community of Practice, it says a bunch of like-minded people to get together for education and training. That's what we do. That's what you do. That's what we want to do. It's a very good term. We have helped Atlantic Canada develop AIM, Atlantic Infrastructure Management. Quebec CERDU has come in, which was developed in 1994. There is Asset Management Ontario. Manitoba is in the process of forming. Saskatchewan is there. Alberta's there. We have helped and do deal very closely with NWT and the Yukon so that they can partner through us. And I know the Yukon is also with BCWWA, BC Water Waste Association is part of that. But we have the network. The level of service training we did, I recall, Glenn, I think the funding was NWT in Atlantic Canada.
Originally.
For that, it was actually done.
And MEP.
Yeah, and the MEP funding from FCM, and there's been a large program there, as you know, which is another resource for it. The level of service training, we have done a number of workshops and are currently doing one with Saanich right now. And there's an example, and while I just wanted to mention that, that's an example of the collaboration we have across Canada. One of our other mandates that we live by every day is please do not reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of time and resources out there, and we can go back, find out what others are doing, and that's what we try to do in Asset Management BC. If we don't have the answer, we'll try and find you a person that does, or we'll try and find you an answer. That's what we're about, and that's where we came from.
Thank you, Wally.
Yeah, it's okay.
You can continue on your
Don't be quiet now.
I wanted to talk about another important event or a series of activities that took place in this period, and that's the report cards, the Canadian infrastructure report cards. The feds were getting involved, and it was recommendation number 2 out of our technology roadmap that we wanted a national database. So the feds engaged an advisory panel. I think every one of us sat on that panel to advise what should we be collecting and such.
Yeah.
And we had StatsCan all lined up to go. Were you not on that?
Nope. No, I have the list.
Research guy.
That's right.
Okay, don't need you right now. Anyways, it was all going to go. StatsCan was getting ready. We had surveys all ready to go. And overnight, a federal minister who will remain unnamed canceled it. Over, done. I've never understood why. I've surmised that they didn't think they would like the answers that they got out of that survey and be attached to it. Regardless, four organizations out of that group that was involved said, well, let's just do it. Plain and simple. FCM, Mike Buda and Adam Thompson, remember those guys? The Canadian Construction Association, Chris McNally and Bill Ferreira were involved. CPWA, Rick Robertshaw was there. And the CSCE, which I was there, and Conrad, you were there. So we just said, let's just do it, take a smaller bite, and we'll get it going. It's important this happens. So it did. And the first report card in 2012, roads, waters, and water systems were basically covered. And then again in 2016, transit was added with CUTA getting involved, as well as sport and rec facilities. So the 16 report was even broader, and the vision was just keep getting till we got it all together. Ultimately, I think the federal government saw the value of the report card that it had, that it wasn't pointing fingers at whatever. It just created the information needed to know what to do. And so, long story short, today, Infrastructure Canada got involved. StatsCan does now collect all that information, I think, on a biannual basis. While there isn't a formal report, the information on which those reports are based are all available. This was a very important, I think, initiative that continues on to this day. Now we have StatsCan doing regular reporting.
Yeah.
I'm just going to add, I'm going to jump in here, and I know it's hard at this group, but so UBCM has taken the methodology from the report card, and it's part of the asset management survey. It's part 2 of the asset management survey that all local governments have to complete to get the funding under the Community Works Fund. So there you go.
Well, I just wanted, the reason I wasn't at that meeting is because you guys, as a committee, came to me in 2010 and asked,
Yes.
you know, could you do an infrastructure report card similar to, you know, what the US ASC had done, or UK or Australia? And I don't know if you remember what my answer was, but if you don't remember, I said, go away. And you asked why? And I said, look, you have 2 lobby organizations and 2 technical organizations that want to come together. You never work together into one report. What kind of a report am I going to write for you that you're going to accept? And actually, you went away, but you came back 2 months later, and you said, what would it take for you to do it? And I put 3 conditions. One of them was that there will not be any recommendations on the report, because you mentioned Saeed Mirza earlier, right? Yeah. Professor at McGill University, emeritus. Well, poor Saeed got crucified, literally, when he reported on the infrastructure deficit back, I don't know when,
85.
85, because of the methodology. Okay, so people didn't like his number, so they criticized the methodology. So I learned from Saeed, and I said, I don't want to have any recommendations. That was first condition. Second condition was to create an advisory committee. So you guys from CSE, CPWA, and so on would administer the money, so you paid my bills, but the content would be the responsibility of an advisory committee.
16 groups.
16 very different groups, and the chair was from CNAM. was
right.
Alain Gontier
Yeah,
from
from
CNET,
Ottawa.
from Ottawa.
From
And,
Ottawa.
and that's how it got done. And when the first infrastructure report card was published in 2012, you know, of course, FCM, CCA, and so on created the messages on what the results did. But I remember counting the number of individual articles, so on, that were published on that. None of them criticized the methodology, but a lot of them questions the recommendations that came from CCA, CSE, and so on. So I was happy. I avoided being crucified like our friend Said Mirza. But one important organization that contributed not only with the report card but others was Renew Canada, Renew Infrastructure. Todd Latham was always very supportive of all the initiatives that we have been going through for asset management, and particularly on this one as well, the infrastructure report card. But your experience may have been different.
No,
Conrad.
it is. But I want to drag Glenn into this. You cannot come clean on this one, because both Glenn and myself was actually on the co-chair of the original advisory committee. I still got the list here.
Okay.
Communicating it is very important. I'll just tell you one very quick story. I was doing a presentation to a council of one of the regional districts on the island, and the report card had just been published, and it said about 27% of the bridges were in poor or very poor condition. So after the presentation, I turned to them and said, "Thank you very much, have a good night." I said, "Oh, one more thing just for you to think about. 27% of the bridges are in poor or very poor condition. So if any of you are driving across a bridge going home tonight, you have a 1 in 4 chance of it collapsing under you." Good night.
So panel, I do want to recognize the time, so if we can.
Yeah, I just want to quickly mention about the program. So we talk about the funding for the federal program. Up to now, over 30 programs has already introduced since the beginning of the decade, the beginning of the century. But particularly the recent one was the Infrastructure Canada, investing in Canada fund. I think this is very unique. It was introduced in 2016. It's $180 billion over 12 years to support local, provincial, and territorial governments funding the infrastructure program. And out of that, there's 2 specific programs, both under the administration of FCM. One of them is the AMBC, which we referenced to. It's a $110 million program designed to support municipal asset management capacity building. And so out of these, there's 4 things that I think is very, very instrumental. That is, build awareness, provide technical assistance, provide grants to municipality. Maybe some of you may already receive grants through the program to improve your building capacity, asset management building capacity, as well as knowledge mobilization. At the same time, though, there was a $75 million program focused on integrating climate change consideration into asset management, adapting to climate change impacts, and reducing greenhouse gas. And that is the MCIP program, Municipality for Climate Innovation Program, which is coming to an end this year. But the MAMP program is continued for another 2 years. I think this is also a major step in the history of developing this capacity, helping municipality to develop capacity.
I just wanted to add something about the building capacity and the tools and so on, and you have this on the slide, talking about ISO 55000 and the series of standards that are associated with asset management. And there 55,000 or 01 and 02 are currently under revision, I believe. But there was a very, very strong presence of Canada and those committees that developed those standards. I was part on the Canadian Mirror Committee for ISO. And the other one that also we talked about, First Nations, and while you mentioned, the presence of First Nations here, and when you basically said, do not reinvent the wheel as part of, looking at, that reminds me of the work that Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation has been doing since 2017, but with their first infrastructure resilience toolkit guide for First Nations back in 2019, and it has a climate risk assessment module, and it has an asset management module as well. And the model that was used to develop this asset management module comes actually from Municipal Affairs Alberta. You know, the toolkit that was made, I believe it was Urban Systems that created that. So again, the idea is you continue building and building and building on the foundations that the work that has been done in the past.
All right, thank you, panel. I think we'll move on, if that's all right, because I'm not doing my job well. But anyway, the future and what lies ahead. So we're living, believe it or not, so just a factoid for you guys, we are living in the year that George Jetson was born, July 31st, 2022. I've got some questions I'm posing to you. Will artificial intelligence replace artists? Will people live on Mars? Have we effectively addressed climate change? Will we be able to address our current challenges? Social justice, healthcare, housing. Will my refrigerator restock itself automatically? And will the Vancouver Canucks ever win a Stanley Cup? These are things we don't know, we can't say for sure. We don't know what lies ahead of us, but considering where we have come from with asset management in Canada and what you've been witness to, I asked the panel, what do you think the future holds for asset management in Canada? I do want to also recognize we are running a little bit late. I do want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to ask you to be succinct, knowing that that's a challenge for everyone.
Yes.
Conrad, start
Okay.
us off.
Well, it's really encouraging to see all of you coming together to talk about asset management, look back at the history, look for the future. We came a long way, obviously, but then at the same time, we've been doing a lot of great work, integrating emerging issue, pressing issue, collaborating among ourselves, municipality, level of government, education institute, and so on. Yes, we're doing quite well, but for the future, we can even do better. For the future, right now, we can improve on how we look at managing infrastructure. We're managing existing infrastructure, but I would like to actually look beyond existing. There's a lot of great opportunity beyond that. If you think about it, we're only looking at existing infrastructure, but we have a lot of opportunity to integrate this asset management concept at the strategy level, at the design level, and concept level, design level, construction level, and O&M level. And that provides a great opportunity to even influence managing our infrastructure better at the early stage.
A frontier, there's many, but a frontier area in my mind is innovation with technology. So important is the information we collect and how we collect it and how we share it. There is stuff that we haven't designed yet. So if this isn't a world for our young folks and the research people and others, this is the time, okay? Innovation and technology, I think, is one of those new fronts that is, in my mind, extremely exciting. And we have not arrived. We'll never arrive, I think. It'll be a continuum.
So what they said, plus, I'm not going to let you off the hook, I think that the integration among disciplines that we've been building, I think that is essential, and the integration with the service focus, I think that we've gone. My personal wish, if that can be achieved, is that procurement is no longer done on the acquisition cost of the asset, but it is done on a life cycle analysis basis, therefore starting to consider climate risks into the equation of managing that asset long term.
Asset management is a process. It's not a function. It's not a task. There's many tasks within it. The Ontario regulation, as an example, is a task-related regulation. You can't legislate a process. When you read the Ontario regulation, it says you've got to produce a plan and produce it to the government. That's a task. There are many tasks within that. All of you, whatever your age is in the room, asset management is going to be around when you retire. It certainly is around when I retire. And it's going to be there forever, because as long as we have assets, we're going to have it. Asset management if you take those words out in what we do, what we say to communities, say we can't do that, whatever that is, we're saying to them, you've managed assets for decades. This is just about good business practices and a better decision process for our councils. We did discuss it at a panel at CNAM a few years ago and said in 25 years we won't be talking about it. But a caution on that, and one of our co-chairs, Andy Wardell from North Van, had said, the risk of us not talking about it is it's like going on a diet, and well, that's over, let's go back to what we did. And if we don't continue to talk about it and keep it high level, we may slip back into our old ways as opposed to just the good business of asset management. So we all have a lot of work to do, and that's the future of asset management, is continuing on this road. I can't see the end of the road, and I don't know that I ever will, and I don't know that you will, because as long as you got an asset, you know, we own a projector at Asset Management BC, we have an asset. There you are. It doesn't matter what they are. You own assets in your house. You have an asset management plan, at least implicitly, for your house and your furnace and your windows and everything else. It's in there everywhere in our life. So that's where asset management is going to go. It's good business, and that's where we need to get it. But we must be assured we don't become complacent. You know, it's like weight loss. When you lose the weight, you've got to continue to do things to keep that off. When you get good business through a new process like this and need to change the culture in the organization, you have to continue to pay attention to it to make sure you don't slide back to the old ways.
Thank you. I just want to add something and put it in the, I guess, the context of you know, I guess in my context, and I came from the provincial government, you know, worked with Brian in the same, you know, overseeing some of the funding programs. And, you know, local governments would come to me and they'd ask for money. And I'd say, how much? And they go, well, I don't know. And I said, well, go back and do some asset management so we understand exactly how much you need. I kind of taken that with moving to UBCM, and now I'm advocating. I'm constantly knocking on Brian's door saying, you got to open up the purse strings. But from an advocacy point, from a UBCM perspective, you know, that information is so powerful, right? And so I actually see, you know, the future is moving to a place where this kind of information, at least the baseline information, and then moving forward with asset management becomes like, it becomes the necessity. I'm going to stay away from the word requirement, but it becomes needed, right? It's a necessity to actually do business. So I'm going to let you guys, I want you guys to give me one word that sums up the future before we go to questions.
Beyond existing.
That's three. So you got to share one, you three.
I
Red.
think you used them up. Innovation.
Integration.
You need two, continuous improvement.
All right. Well, there we go with 6 words instead of All right. Well, that concludes the panel discussion and the questions. I'm going to open it up for questions. Well, before we go to questions, I also want to. Oh, sorry, I didn't see this slide here. That's okay. Sorry, I wasn't seeing the right slide. I want to thank FCM and the Government of Canada to help us stream this, and want to thank all the participants out there in the virtual part of Canada for participating. And if there are any questions for the panel, please ask them now. And oh, I see that is a question that was raised by Todd Latham. What role has media played in the Canadian asset management journey? Has AM been communicated effectively in business and consumer press? Anyone from the panel want to tackle that one?
Oh, I can start. You know, certainly coming from Todd and Renew Canada, and the fact that, you know, asset management, you know, had prominence in more of the technical media. I would revert the question and blame it on us for not having properly communicated asset management benefits to the general media, so that they would be, you know, being our voice, you know, with the public. And you know, Todd and I go back a long time when I think I can say that now. When I was at NRC, I was so fed up of having poor communications about what we were doing that I ghostwrote it. And I sent it to Todd, and Todd would publish it with whatever name he was, and ended up, doing the same for, after I left NRC with the Globe and Mail and the others, and, I even ended up being the president of the Press Club of Canada as an engineer. But I was ghostwriting because I wanted the message to go out. We still have to do a better job at providing the media. The media is going to take whatever you provide them, and they're going to publish it. We're not doing a good job. We're not trained for that, but I think that we need to make an effort to communicate what is asset management and the benefits to the broad public.
Yeah, I think we learned from guys like Todd who helped us get that message out, because as you say, we're not good at getting it out. We were doing, as you can see, all these events that took place were singular events taking place in one particular area, sometimes broader, sometimes not, and the story needed to get out. And so I was always appreciative of Renew Canada, the publication that grew out of this and supported entirely the asset management industry as being exceedingly important. People read those articles and I think helped form opinions. We couldn't go and speak to everybody, but the media covers a much broader area. So I think they were, I would have to say, very effective in helping us put that message out.
I know the gentleman very well that wrote this question, and certainly his magazine is Canadian. It's well worth reading, Renew magazine, and he's been a real champion for infrastructure in Canada and asset management. There are other publications paying an awful lot of attention to it. Recently, myself and others had a call from the Globe and Mail, one of their reporters doing in-depth story. And it was after the situation in Merritt, where the entire sewage plant overflowed into the town, therefore contaminating the water system, and there was no water. And her question to me was, did we build all the sewage plants in the wrong place? And I said, yeah, we did. We put them in floodplains. We put our pump stations. Says, are we going to move them? I said, we're not going to move $100 billion worth of assets, but there's a lot of grant programs now out there to protect those plants and protect the water systems. So there's an example with the Globe and Mail taking an interest in, why did this happen? Why did that community have to vacate the community because of water? And we're seeing that. If you go back, right, as was earlier mentioned by Reg, with the Walkerton inquiry started to do this. There is a lot of media attention. We hear one of the questions, we talked about having questions with our recent municipal elections for those running for council. I'm going to cut the taxes, and our first question to them is, good, what services are you cutting? Oh, I'm not cutting services. Well, those don't compute. And those are the messages we have to carry to the politicians, and many of them are improving immensely. And I'm not finding, we used to talk about the politicians really, we had a 4-year window. I'm not finding that with a lot of them now. They really do want to do a good job. There are those that want to get just elected for 4 years. But we're finding a lot of attention, and I know I spent a lot of time with our councillors in the city where I was living in Nanaimo, and they were really interested in understanding what staff were doing, and they were much more open to staff bringing them because they understood it a little better from a whole bunch of things. So that communications at all levels with our councils, with media, local papers, whatever, is really very critical that people understand the importance to their own lives of what we're doing, protecting the tax dollars, getting good, better business processes that effectively use those without compromising service.
Yeah, I find the same as communication we heard so much is so important. And the media could be a very, very powerful partner. And going back to my own experience, that when we have an issue, when we have an infrastructure strategy, they were there listening to you. And when we introduce new program, they were there. So I really think that we have great opportunity also to work with them in a more effective manner. Maybe we have not really partnered enough with them.
They need to be proactive.
Got a question over here on table 9. Maybe Russell. Only 2 answer.
Thank you for sharing the stories. And I also thank you for being pioneers, because I think we need more of you guys. My question is that I find it personally always really challenging working in asset management, that you have a lot of people with different expertise, knowledge, and of different areas, and you try to get them on the same table. And often you're faced with that the people are not speaking the same language. So in your experience, do you have the same feeling? And do you think, being in the business for decades now, that this kind of like improved over time?
So I told my friend Wally here that I was going to answer because he basically has the same experience, and they both have, also have the same experience. And I absolutely agree with you in terms of, you know, the language issue. We had to overcome that language issue way back when we created the National Asset Management Working Group and so on, because we had to work with planners, with financial officers, with accountants. And, you know, Wally will tell you, if he was allowed to talk, that, you know, we got into a meeting and we were in Montreal, and there was the director of finance from the city of Montreal, and there were, you know, the chair, the president of the Canadian Institute of Planners, and a whole bunch of engineers. And we were talking and talking, and they were talking about deferred maintenance, and we were talking about infrastructure deficits. And we're having a whole bunch of problems understanding what we were each talking about until we stopped.
We were about to hit each other.
We were, well, you were. We basically put a break and said, okay, finance officers, what do you call deferred maintenance? What does it mean to you? And what does it mean to engineers? We spent probably, what, an hour and a half or more defining the terminology that we were going to use. Now, this was the end of the afternoon. After that, we went to a good restaurant, had a couple of good bottles of wine. Everybody agreed, and we were talking. And the next day, we were very productive. But it is a question of making sure that you understand the language and you understand each other. The other thing is that know the limitations of the other professions and clarify the expectations that the other professions have of you. Once you have established this framework, then you will see the work just is very, very fulfilling. It goes great.
What we learned from that meeting was no one was wrong. It's just with our training, and in that case, technical and finance, had a different perception of what those two words meant, deferred maintenance. And we've never forgotten that story, very obviously, because it's absolutely critical to what you're saying. We get many things in here with language, and we have to make sure that when you bring those to our attention, we find a way to sort that out and discuss it.
All right, I don't see, was there another question? All right.
Thank you for your presentation this morning, and I guess you're not too old till your eyebrows start turning gray, so you guys are still in good shape. I want to thank you guys for, talking about not inventing a new wheel. But we continue to have to add to this wheel, we all know. And I consider ourselves to be new. I come from the village of Kitlac-Damix, where we've just joined, we signed our modern day treaty in 2000. And what I'm trying to say is that, hearing from our grandfathers years and years and years ago, if you don't feed the horse, it's not going to do anything for you. So we have to continually feed this horse that you're speaking about, our assets, so that they stay alive. And yes, you people in this room, the young people, are the horses. Yes. And if you don't take interest and carry the work that these young gentlemen at the front table here have started for us, it's going to die. So I want to thank you guys. But I have one question from the gentleman I kept hearing bringing up Edmonton. Hey, how has the Anthony Hindi affected Edmonton? Thank you.
It's done. Anthony is great.
All right, I got time for one more question. I mean, we're already over here, but one more. I'm hoping the streaming continues and the French translation continues for those folks joining us from Quebec or any French-speaking location.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and all the notes and stories. For that language issue, do you think commonly accepted training or certification process may help speaking all of us in the same language and help us to understand the tools and techniques which should be standardized? For example, we all accept PMI and PMP as standard project management certification, right? When we do the project management things in our work. So something similar to that, do you think will help advancing asset management in different organizations as we go forward? Thank you.
Well, my quick reaction to standardizing the language, I think that it's already been standardized. I think that we have international standards and so on. I think that what we need, and if there is a communication failure within a group, is, you know, there is the social interactions between the group members that have to make the effort to understand, you know, each other, to understand what the limitations of the others are and the expectations are. There needs to be a human effort, and that is not imposed by, let's say, training or anything like that. I think that would be my reaction, my lesson from our history.
I'll let one panelist add to that, and then we're going to wrap it
You
up.
choose.
I'll choose Reg, because I don't think you've answered.
I didn't answer that yet.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the early years, when we were developing asset management processes, I felt myself competing with my other consulting, I'll say, colleagues from other companies. And I always felt I had the best process. They felt they had the best process. They were different, they were the same, they were based on the same principles, but there needs to be a convergence ultimately on a national basis of how you approach it. Asset Management BC has pushed training courses from certain groups and so on. It doesn't matter to me where they come from. As long as they're consistent and appropriate, we should try to centralize the approach so that it's common across the country in some fashion. I think that improves the ability for rolling up information and knowledge for policies that return funding and approaches of how to do things like that. So ultimately, I think that convergence needs to happen.
All right, thanks for that, Reg. All right, I'm going to have to wrap this up. I do want to thank our panelists for coming today. I'm going to ask you just to stay there for now. I also want to thank everyone who's participated virtually. And hopefully you'll be able to stay on for the next 5 to 8 minutes. We've got a very short ceremony, but it's our inaugural ceremony for the Asset Management BC Awards. For those in the room, we're going to go to the ceremony, our awards ceremony. It will be short. It'll be succinct. It'll be wonderful. And then we'll have a break for lunch, and that lunch will go till 1. So on that note, I am going to move directly to the ceremony.